Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to CSIS this morning for our discussion on what the administration should do on North Korea. My name is Victor Cha. I'm a senior advisor and Korea chair here at CSIS, as well as a professor at Georgetown University. And we have two very distinguished guests who I will introduce in a moment. First, we want to give a warm welcome to our digital audience online. So for everyone on Twitter, we will be live tweeting today using hashtag CSIS Live. And we also want to thank Samsung Electronics America for their support of this event. Well, unless you've been living on another planet, I think you've been noticing that North Korea offers up a lot for discussion these days. The new leadership apparently loves things Western, including Walt Disney and amusement parks. Earlier this year, there was a visit by the executive chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt, and I think some of you who are real North Korea watchers have all read the blog that his daughter has written about her trip to North Korea. If there were ever an opportunity for the new leadership to signal reform, it might have been a meeting with the chairman of Google, but of course that did not happen. And instead, he met with Dennis Rodman, who he proclaimed to be his new BFF, and who on national television here in the United States told George Stephanopoulos that all that the new North Korean leader wanted to do was for President Obama to call him and talk about the many things they have in common. In many ways, the North Korea issue has become a caricature of itself. It is a combination of reality TV meets cable news meets TMZ. Because Rodman apparently has now said that he has a daughter that he met. But at the same time, it's a very deadly, serious situation. In December of 2012, the satellite launch demonstrated successfully ballistic missile launch technology. There are certainly other thresholds they need to cross, but this was undeniably an important one over many other failures. And even though we don't know the dependability of their technology, the fact is that they tried to do two of these tests two tests in 1 year, and one could only imagine if the second test had also failed in a very critical year for North Korea, which gives one a sense that they must have had some confidence in their technology. Of course, in February 2013, we had the third nuclear test. We don't know much about that, but it appears to be an advancement based on at least the seismic signature. So what has the United States done in response to all this? Well, initially we had very clear statements condemning the North Koreans for these tests that took place in December and in February. Following that, we had a visit by the National Security Advisor, Mr. Donilon, to South Korea on the inauguration of President Park Geun-hye, presumably to coordinate policy in the aftermath of the tests. We have the new UN Security Council Resolution 2094, which imposes a variety of sanctions, including sanctions against the main foreign exchange bank in North Korea. And then we had a speech by National Security Advisor Donilon at the Asia Society in which he talked about very clearly using all U.S. instruments of power to deal with this North Korean threat. And then last week, we had the announcement from Secretary of Defense Hagel of the intention to deploy 14 new interceptors here on the United States. And this week we're seeing visits by high-level DoD and Treasury officials to the region, presumably a visit by Secretary Kerry soon, and then the summit, date not yet public, but the summit between President Obama and Park Geun-hye in May. So with this backdrop, the questions are we headed in the right direction? Is policy moving in the right direction? Is strategic patience working? And to try to help us answer these questions, we have two, I think, fantastic people joining us this morning. General Walter Sharp commanded the United Nations Command Republic of Korea, United States Combined Forces Command, and United States Forces Korea from June 2008 to July 2011. His command positions included Regimental Commander, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, Fort Polk, Louisiana, Assistant Division Commander for Maneuver, 2nd Infantry Division, Camp Red Cloud, South Korea, and Division Commander, 3rd Infantry Division, Fort Stewart, Georgia. He commanded troops in Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti, and the Multinational Division in Bosnia. He's consulting for Monitor National Security Practice, SK Engineering and Construction, and involved in strategy and policy discussions at several DC area think tanks, including CSIS. General Sharp is a graduate of West Point, was commissioned as an armor officer, and he has earned a Master of Science degree in Operations Research and System Analysis from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Sitting in the center is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, who served as Director of the National Counterproliferation Center until January 2012. From 2006 to 2010, he served in the Office of the Director of the National Intelligence as the North Korea Mission Manager, where he was responsible for integrating collection analysis on North Korea across the intelligence community, identifying and filling gaps in surveillance, in intelligence and planning, and overseeing execution of strategies. Ambassador DeTrani also served as a special envoy for six-party talks with North Korea and the U.S. representative to Quito from 2003 to 2006. He served throughout the IC as Executive Assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence, Director of European Operations, and Director of East Asia Operations. He's a graduate of NYU and also went to NYU School of Law and Graduate School of Business. Gentlemen, if each of you would like to start out with a few remarks. General Sharp, perhaps we could start with you.
Great. Thank you, Victor, and thank you and CSIS for hosting this today, and it's great to see and be with you again, and with Joe also. Joe's been a real patriot to the United States and has made a huge difference, so I'm honored to be on the stage here with you today. I do appreciate this opportunity to give kind of my thoughts on some things that the administration, that President Obama and his team should look at potentially to make a difference in North Korea over the next several years. But before I start that, I do think it's important that we kind of reset, and Victor did it a little bit, but just very briefly look at what has happened on the peninsula over the last 4 years, just the last 4 years. First off, I think most people in here understand that North Korea is the 4th largest military in the world. They have the largest artillery force in the world, most of which can range Seoul today. They have 70% of their forces forward deployed right along the demilitarized zone, an extremely dangerous special ops capability. They are working to be able to deliver a nuclear weapon anywhere in the world. Today they have over 800 missiles, all of which that could range Korea, many of which that can range Japan, some of which that they are working on to be able to range the United States and Australia and other places. Many of those missiles can carry can carry chemical and biological weapons, and they are obviously working to be able to make some of them to be nuclear capable. We believe that they are developing a road mobile ICBM in the KN-08. Over the last 4 years, 2009, a Taepodong test, a nuclear test. On the 4th of July, 7 missiles into the EC. 2010, they sunk the rock ship, the Cheonan. They attacked Waipido. They killed dozens of South Korean military and civilians, and they revealed their highly enriched uranium centrifuges. 2012, 2013, 2 more Taepodong tests, one of which was successful. A nuclear test. They abrogated the armistice again, and they directly threatened the United States multiple times. At the same time that military context is going on, tens of thousands, if not more, dying of malnutrition. Latest UN report, 25% of the children are stunted due to malnutrition, and 2/3 of the people in North Korea do not know where their next meal is coming from. At the same time, unbelievable human rights violations. Estimates, I think, are around 200,000 in labor concentration camps. They do not abide by the basic human rights as laid out by the United Nations of life, liberty, security, due process, freedom to travel and leave a country, and freedom of opinion and expression of that opinion. So in summary, North Korea is a stronger, more threatening, and more dangerous country today than it was just several years ago. They are approaching the ability to be able to attack anywhere in the world with a nuclear weapon, and they have clearly demonstrated the willingness and the ability to strike and kill people in South Korea. And all the time there's continued starvation and human rights violations in North Korea. So with that as a context, what would my recommendations be for how we should move forward? First, diplomatically and economically. I do think we should continue diplomatic pressure to try to get North Korea to change and work to all nations around the world to be able to try to apply that pressure. I think we should continue with UN sanctions. I think they are necessary. I think they have hurt North Korea, but they are clearly not sufficient to cause change. I think we continue to strengthen the Republic of Korea-U.S. alliance diplomatically, economically, and militarily. And I think we should continue to push China to force North Korea to change. I am a believer that China could force North Korea to change if they're willing to cut off all aid. We should push China to do these actions, but I do believe that we should not make China a required component of our strategy, because they may choose to continue not to make the tough choices to really force a change in North Korea. I think we should do more dialogue with the Republic of Korea, China, and Japan on what a unified peninsula looks like, and how do we do this in a way that protects and enhances, actually, the vital national interest of those countries. Next, informationally. I think we need to be much more vocal on human rights and provocative acts of North Korea. This needs to be a continuous drumbeat and not just during time of crisis. We need to greatly increase the effort of getting information to the people of North Korea. We need to make this a cornerstone of our strategy for change in North Korea. We need to work with the Republic of Korea and others to develop the messages. We need to fund multiple means of broadcast to get information into North Korea. And we must clearly state our goal is to break the isolation of the people of North Korea and to inform them about freedom and about their leadership. And then finally, I think we should make it clear to the people of North Korea that the world is ready to help them and to back them if they force a change within their own country. And then finally, militarily, and as you could guess, this is the longest list because that's my area of most expertise, I guess. But militarily, I do think that we have the strongest alliance in the world today between the Republic of Korea and the United States, our military alliance, and that needs to be continued to be strengthened. I think we need to develop a more robust intelligence capability, a system that can look into deep into North Korea and do this 24 hours a day. Persistence is the key to defeat North Korea camouflage and deception capabilities. Republic of Korea and U.S. systems, and I applaud the Republic of Korea in their efforts to buy and develop key, persistent, long-endurance, interoperable intelligence systems. I would recommend that we develop a regional intelligence sharing construct between the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the United States. The ROC-Japan Intel Sharing Agreement is key to not only an effective missile defense system, but also in the case of conflict. And I would recommend to the Republic of Korea that they agree to a ROC-Japanese Intel Sharing Agreement now and not to wait until after conflict starts. I'd recommend that we continue to develop a layered and robust missile defense system that includes defensive and offensive systems that can quickly strike anywhere in North Korea. Increased defensive capabilities such as radar, Aegis ships, and other lower tier capabilities are critical to be able to counter the North Korea ballistic missile capabilities. But I think it's also very important that we have an offensive capability, and I applaud the Republic of Korea's efforts to buy a strike fighter that is interoperable with U.S. systems and is also capable of stealthily getting into North Korea, surviving the North Korea air defense systems, and has the ability to precisely strike anywhere in North Korea. I would recommend that we continue to develop attack systems to quickly destroy North Korean launchers. I applaud the decision by the Obama administration on the new missile guidelines, as I think this will make a big capability difference. I think that we should continue with provocation planning and exercises. We need to enable the execution of a well thought out, thorough responses that includes the ability and the willingness to strongly punish North Korea for any attack actions, and it also includes escalation control. I do believe that reactions should not just be a tit for tat. They need to hold something that is important to Kim Jong-un at risk. And we need to be able to do this across diplomatic, economic, military, different elements of power. And then finally, I believe that we should continue with instability planning and exercises. We need to be ready to respond to instability in order to get control of North Korean nuclear weapons, protect the North Korean people, and to stabilize the country. And we need to do this not only with the Republic of Korea and the U.S., but also have discussions with Japan, United Nations sending states, and ideally China. So the bottom line of my recommendations is that North Korea is able and becoming more willing to threaten the Republic of Korea, Japan, and the United States. We need to continue to put diplomatic and economic pressure on North Korea. I would recommend that we increase our informational action to inform the world about North Korea and inform the people of North Korea about freedom, human rights, and our willingness to support them. I would recommend that we increase our military capabilities, especially in the areas of intelligence, missile defense, air and ground strike operations, and provocation planning. And then finally, we need to increase planning for instability, diplomatically, informationally, militarily, and economically. So in conclusion, when any country really considers actions to change a country like North Korea, there's always a balance between actions that are focused on stability and gradual change, and actions that focus on forcing a change. And I guess I believe that it's time for the United States, the Republic of Korea, China, and indeed the world to shift that balance to forcing North Korea to change. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, General Sharp. So now we'll go to Ambassador DeTrani.
Thank you. That was excellent, General Sharp. It's an honor being here with you and Dr. Shah. Thank you, CSIS, for inviting me. A few comments. I've been looking at this issue, the nuclear issue in North Korea, for about 10 years. And just some general comments. This last year, since January of 2012, I was probably one of a few who initially was guardedly optimistic. When Kim Jong-un came into power, I saw some significant personnel decisions he made, putting a party man in charge of the general political department, Chae Young-hae, vice marshal, elevating his uncle, Jang Sung-taek, to a very prominent position, removing some of the hardliners, Kim Yong-chun, the Minister of Defense, Lee Young-ho, the Chief of Staff. This is a man whom we thought maybe wasn't ready for leadership, but he took some major decisions and he showed he was sort of in command, and he was putting some people in. And again, I think a key piece on that was the general political department, where a party man was overseeing the military. That element, that guarded optimism lasted for a few months. We moved forward to the Leap Day Agreement, 29 February, where the North Koreans committed to a moratorium on missile launches and nuclear tests, in return for nutritional assistance and movement forward. These are positive. So you have those first 3 months that sort of looks like things were moving. And then we saw what happened in April with the missile launch. Immediately thereafter, as Dr. Char and General Sharp said, immediately thereafter, December of 2012, the second missile launch. And then in February, a nuclear test. And with that, most recently, some of the most vitriolic statements coming out of Pyongyang, to include a preemptive strike. Some other commentary coming out of Pyongyang, which is way beyond the pale. So, me watching this country for about 10 years, being involved with some of the negotiations, having some initial optimism up front based on some decisions, and seeing that pendulum go in the other direction to where we are today. Where we are today, when we're talking about, as you just said, General, we're actually putting interceptors up there, talking about missile defense, because here's a country that's threatening the United States and threatening the Republic of Korea. This is not tolerable. This is not where we need to be. I personally believe, given the dynamics in the region, given the dynamics certainly in Pyongyang, with the drills they have going on in Pyongyang, and with the exhortations to the public about preparing for war and what have you, I don't think this is a normal situation any longer. I agree with the comments General Sharp made. I think we all agree this is something, and it's not to use the term rocket science, but this is not rocket science. This needs to be diffused, and it needs to be diffused quickly. We just can't let it keep going. Now, we're taking those precautions as necessary, and we're working with the ROK allies, and I think the North has the message, you better not do anything stupid, because there will be consequences, significant ones. And as you mentioned, General, we have Security Council resolutions on the books now, sanctions because North Korea did violate with their missile launch, and they did violate UN Security Council resolutions with their nuclear test. There are consequences of that. You can't be part of the UN and say, we're not obliged then to follow resolutions. You are. You can't have it both ways. And I think this is where we are with North Korea right now. I think, and I'll end on this note, I think the key here is, and it's a key because we just saw a very encouraging conversation between President Xi Jinping and Park Geun-hye, where President Xi Jinping, and we just saw last week with the Party Congress, the president, now we have a premier there, the government's in place, he has his leadership team in place, he has his foreign affairs leadership team there, where Xi Jinping, the leadership there, working with the Republic of Korea, working with the United States, working with the international community, certainly the government of Japan, Russia, the international community. This is required. This is where China, as we saw in April of 2003, where China interceded and brought three parties to the table, the United States, the DPRK, and China, when things were getting very tense on the Korean Peninsula, and they said, what is going on here? Let's sit down here and let's put a process in motion so we can get some sort of normalcy. And we work towards peaceful resolution, and that's when we started the six-party process. So my point is, diffuse it quickly. China has the leverage. Let's not talk about we have no influence. China, as the general said, China has extreme leverage, and it makes sense for the DPRK also. I can't imagine that they would want to see the devastation, and we talk about the economic situation, the malnourishment, the elements of the population that possibly could die of starvation and so forth. They need to get back on a different path, and that path is what we were doing with September 2005, 19 September 2005, the joint statement, which spoke to comprehensive, verifiable denuclearization of all their programs, to include uranium enrichment, in exchange for security assurances, economic assistance, a dialogue that would commence once they come back to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. Again, as a non-nuclear weapon state, a dialogue for the provision of light water reactors. This is what they've been saying, civilian nuclear programs. This is all very achievable. But the key right now is, let's not get too optimistic and go too far down the road. Let's diffuse what we have now. Let's ensure this does not get out of hand so we don't stumble into significant conflict, which could lend itself to horrific ends. So this is, and I think China, with the new government in place now, and with the new government in the ROK, and certainly with the encouragement of the US and the new government in Japan with the Abe government, I think this is the perfect time for China to get in there defuse it as they did in April of 2003, and then move us to the path, and not negotiations for the sake of negotiations. Kim Jong-un is never committed to the September 2005 joint statement as his father did, Kim Jong-il. He's never committed to denuclearization as his father did. He needs to do that. And that's when we can sort of move forward through diplomacy, through negotiations, while we ensure that, and as General Sharp said, we ensure that the Republic of Korea, the US, our allies in Japan, we're all robust militarily. We're all very much involved with comprehensive defensive measures. We move with diplomacy. We ensure that we're whether it's nuclear, whether we're talking about missile defense, that's very, very, very key. But North Korea has to understand this is not the path we're going on. So that my recommendation would just be diffuse it now. Let's see if they're serious about denuclearization. If they're serious, let's reconstitute the six-party process, and let's go back to the September 2005 joint statement, which speaks to comprehensive, verifiable denuclearization for ultimate normalization, to include the illicit activity element there, because we should never forget that. We should never forget the fact that this is a country that counterfeits the US $100 bill, is involved in a lot of illicit activity, and speaks to the issue of human rights, which we're all very sensitive to. And that has always been part of our dialogue with the DPRK. So with that, Victor.
Thank you, Joe. Let me just ask each of you one question before we go to the audience, if that's okay. And let me start with Joe. You mentioned China quite a bit in your remarks, and the role that they can play in terms of helping to diffuse the situation. There is, among all of us who look at this, there's this perennial debate, discussion about whether the latest North Korean provocation is enough to cause China to turn the screws even harder. There's been a lot of chatter about these pieces written by Shending Lee and Deng Yuan on how China should cut its losses with North Korea. I mean, in your sense, where do you think we are on this in terms of China?
No, that's a good question, Victor. I personally, I think China is very concerned. It's not in China's interest to see North Korea going the way they're going. It's not in China's interest to see North Korea retaining its nuclear weapons capability and enhancing those capabilities to include the ability to potentially down the road to mate a nuclear weapon to a delivery system. This is not in China's interest. And there's a proliferation piece there that touches China, touches all of us in a significant way. So I think we're on the same page when we talk about ultimately denuclearization. And I think China's position now, it's not only with the Xi Jinping government coming in, with the premier, Li Keqiang, where the leadership is in place, but the foreign affairs team is in place. We have Yang Jiechi replacing Dai Bingguo as a state council, where you have Wang Yi replacing Yang as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and reportedly Cui Tiankai coming here as the ambassador. These gentlemen all are intimate with the North Korea issue. And they're all very, very, very intimate with the six-party process. And they all understand so well the possibility, if North Korea retains those nuclear weapons, the possibility of a nuclear arms race in the region and the whole proliferation issue there. So I think with the foreign policy team in China now, with Yang Jiechi and certainly Wang Yi and now Cui Tiankai coming, I think that team, intimate with North Korea, intimate with the six-party process, I think they will be able to really have impact on the DPRK on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, they are quite, I mean, we all worked with them during the six-party process.
Right.
And I mean, they were both facilitators, but they were also quite frustrated at times.
Quite frustrated
with behavior.
That's exactly right.
Quite well. General Sharp, thank you for your presentation and a fantastic list of things, a lot of homework for people to do. I mean, given your experience on the peninsula, everyone worries about the next provocation. And we did a study here at CSIS where we looked at the propensity for North Korea to do something after the inauguration of a new South Korean president. And we found that there actually is a pattern there, that they, really going back to 1992, they have tested every South Korean president within weeks of their taking office. And I guess the question I would have is, what are you worried about in terms of the next thing that they might do? I mean, there's their fiery rhetoric on the one hand, but as a former USFK commander, what are the things that you would worry about?
Well, I think that if North Korea does do another kinetic attack on the South Korea. It's similar to the sinking of the Cheonan or the attack on Waipido. I'm very confident that the Republic of Korea and the U.S. alliance is ready to very quickly and very strongly respond back into North Korea. And I do believe that, as I said in my brief remarks, that it shouldn't just be a tit for tat. We need to make it clear, and I think South Korea has made it very clear to Kim Jong-un, that any strike into South Korea, there will be things taken out in North Korea that are of value to Kim Jong-un. And I think in order to start changing that dynamic, let's face it, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il in the past have been able to do very, not only provocations, but I characterize them as attacks with very little response going back. And I think November of 2010 changed that dynamic. The people of South Korea, the United States now are demanding, and there will be a very strong response that goes back. So to your question, what we all worry about then is how do you control escalation when you get into that situation? And it is very important that we work very hard to, where is that balance point between changing the ability of Kim Jong-un to strike anywhere and not have a strong enough response versus having him think, okay, I've got to think of other ways to try to influence other than kinetic attacks because I'm not willing to accept what's going back. And then I think the best way to be able to help control that escalation is to have a very strong dialogue, lines of communication that are open between the United States, the Republic of Korea, China, Japan, and ideally North Korea. And I think we need to work very hard on that.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we will now open for questions from the audience. If you could make your question brief and identify who you are, and we'll start right here.
Good morning. It's David Wood from the Huffington Post. General Sharp, could you talk a little bit about what mechanisms there are for escalation control? And you mentioned some other things that had to do with provocation, with what actions we would take after a provocation. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about precisely how you coordinate those with others in the region, and especially with North Korea. For example, is there any kind of back-channel communications with the North that could be useful in a crisis?
I know of no current back-channel capabilities. Now, again, I've been out of there for a year and a half. I know that we in the Republic of Korea try to work through all different types of mechanisms to be able to talk to North Korea. You know, recently you've seen North Korea said that, and they have cut the lines again at Panmunjom, but they do that all the time. So I think the mechanisms to be able to help control escalation are mainly through China. To be able to have a robust discussion between the United States and the Republic of Korea in time of crisis in order to be able to get information to China to get it back into North Korea to be able to help to de-escalate or stop the escalation of an attack that and a response from that attack.
Chris.
Thanks very much. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. You know, I think the more we listen to this concept of escalation, I think the more chilled we all should be, because the whole concept of controlling the other guy's response to what you just did is based on the definition of a wag, isn't it? You know, you just don't know the mix of emotion and pride. And you know, we now know that Saddam, for example, didn't want us to know he didn't have WMD because he was afraid the Iranians wouldn't take him seriously. You know, so I think the thing we're all wrestling with as we listen to your enormously coherent list of things to do is when we, well, in the unhappy event that there is a kinetic response, a kinetic action by North Korea, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that that our response, the joint response with South Korea, in a sense has to escalate beyond what they did in order to make the point to them that you can't just do this stuff. Have I understood you correctly to say, in a sense, our response would itself be an escalation? And are we perhaps contradicting ourselves? So thank you.
I don't believe we are contradicting ourselves. I believe that if you just look at the number of systems that North Korea has compared to the Republic of Korea in the history of provocations and attacks over the past, we've got to change the dynamic and we've got to take something at risk. And I'm not saying that that risk needs to go all the way to, an attack on Pyongyang or anything, but I think there are legitimate targets that we should consider that helped enable the North Korean attack. It needs to be measured, but there needs to be actions that are taken that will make a next attack more difficult, both technically and from a risk-benefit calculation for Kim Jong-un to take.
Yes.
My name is Xiaoyang Shao of Envoy Daily, Shanghai, China. I have a quick question for Ambassador DeTrani. You mentioned that there's an urgency to diffuse the tension on the Korean Peninsula, and you also believe that China has the leverage now. But my question is, what should or can U.S. do to help diffuse the situation, since we've seen that the recent provocative rhetorics from the North Korean are largely aimed at the United States? So what can U.S. do to?
Well, I think what the U.S. could do is what the U.S. has been doing. It's a willingness.
Other than pushing for a sanction.
Well, yes. Well, sanctions it's a community. The sanctions are UN security sanctions. Those are not U.S. specific, right? Although we do have an executive order that speaks to some of those issues. But I think what the U.S. can do is what the U.S. has been doing, a willingness to return to negotiations, the six-party process, as long as it's meaningful negotiations and it lends itself to denuclearization in a meaningful way. The U.S. is certainly not threatening North Korea. The U.S. was prepared to provide nutritional assistance going back 1 year, literally this month. So the U.S. has been there, and the U.S. is committed to what we agreed to in September of 2005, and that's what we're committed to, a peaceful resolution to this issue, which is what North Korea also agreed to. So I think what the U.S. can do is continue to show its willingness to resume these negotiations as long as they're meaningful, and North Korea stops escalating. North Korea stops nuclear tests and missile launches. They're in violation of Security Council resolutions, and it's just lending itself to, if you will, an unsettled situation in the region with the potential for, if you will, a nuclear arms race. Because others are not just going to sit there and watch North Korea build capability. So I think that's what U.S. can do and so forth. And I think that's pretty positive, to be honest with you.
Yes. Wait for the mic.
I'm Joshua Pollack from SAIC. A question for the panel. What do you believe is motivating North Korea's current course of action? And could you give us some ideas about how your recommended course of action would influence thinking in Pyongyang?
You want to start?
I think that Kim Jong-un is seeing a very difficult balance. I think he is seeing an economy that has totally failed, some information getting into North Korea that I'm sure he concerns about whether he can maintain control of his people in North Korea. I think he has seen a very strong Republic of Korea U.S. alliance over the last 4 or 5 years that have not been willing just to give things to North Korea in exchange for them temporarily being quiet. And it is a dynamic that I think in his calculations, he's saying, I've got to pose to the people of North Korea to continue to convince them that the Republic of Korea and the United States are an enemy, and the sacrifices that the people of North Korea make are necessary for his military first policy. And he uses the attacks and the provocations to be able to point out to the people of North Korea that their sacrifices are worthwhile and needed. I think he has seen that in order to threaten the world, not just the Republic of Korea, I believe in his mind nuclear weapons are essential. And so the ability to be able to deliver those anywhere in the world is why he's developing ballistic missile capabilities. Unfortunately, what he has seen over his brief history and his father's much longer history is a willingness to talk and talk and talk, which has given North Korea the time to do all that I just said. And I think the world is saying, clearly the United States and the Republic of Korea is saying, we're not going to do that any longer. I agree with Joe that the best course of action here is to get talks going again, but not to just diffuse the situation. It is to resolve the situation. And so I think I gave, like you said, a list of things that I think could help move in that direction. But I think it's key that internally within North Korea, that move starts to happen also.
You know, and further to that, and I agree with that, General, I would say I think some of what we see from North Korea, or a great deal, is their attempt to lock in their nuclear weapons program. It's to be accepted as a nuclear weapons state, so that negotiations become, if you will, non-proliferation negotiations and not denuclearization negotiations. And I think that's what we saw with the missile launches, and that's what we saw with the nuclear test, that hopefully these other countries come back, and now we talk about non-proliferation and accept us as a nuclear weapons state, and that's not where we are, and that's not where we'll ever be, and that's not what anyone wants. So I think that's their attempt from the DPRK side, and I think they're realizing that's not tolerable.
Alan?
Thank you very much. Alan Romberg, Stimson Center. For General Sharp, just a question. You talked about making clear to the people of North Korea that if they sought to change their government, we would be supportive. I want to know if you mean to be understood to say we would support overthrow of the government, because I think a lot of people will take what you said to be saying that. So that's the question for you. And for Joe, you talk about the great urgency of defusing the situation. For the U.S., though, it's sort of steady on course. And it sounds to me as though your only hope for that really is China. And I wonder if you could talk about what the strategic assessment in China is that would really lead it to make the kind of dramatic change that I think would be necessary to achieve what you're talking about.
You know, I believe that we should work so that the people of North Korea, who are, as you know, are, I believe, the most isolated country in the world, that those people understand basic human rights, freedoms, democracy, freedoms, and what their government is doing to them. I would hope what they would do then is internally try to get their leadership, their government, to change, to be more willing to open up to aid and assistance that the world, I do believe, is ready to give to the people of North Korea. But ultimately, it's up to the people of North Korea how that would resolve itself in the end.
You know, Alan, very good question. The only comment I would have on that is I believe most would agree North Korea has gone beyond the pale. Threatening the U.S. with the nuclear preemptive strike, cutting the the communications on the DMZ, the Red Cross hotline, and walking away from the 53 armistice and the North-South denuclearization agreements of 92. These acts are really significant with respect to escalation. And therefore, the element of unpredictability, of things getting out of hand, where they may go too far thinking they can get away with it. Because in many ways, they've gotten away with a lot in the past, and the consequences have been very minimal. And they may miscalculate, and there will be a response, and that will lend itself to what we've been talking about this morning, an element of escalation and getting out of hand. So I think most of us believe that we're at that point where it has to be now managed and controlled and initially diffused to ultimately get a resolution, because it's resolution that counts. It's causing this. But I think we're at a stage that we've never been at before, Alan. I think China sees the commentary coming out of Pyongyang in a similar fashion. I believe what we saw with the UN Security Council resolution of last month, where China was involved with the drafting and the support of that resolution, is indicative of the sense that North Korea is going beyond the pale. North Korea is truly pushing it. So I think there's a commonality of assessment on some of these issues.
In the back, yes.
Hi, Chuck Lutz from National Defense University. I'd like, this is for all the panelists, I'd like for you to be able to address the introduction of potential for cyber attacks as provocations, how that fits on the escalation ladder, and the potential for miscalculations. Yesterday's attack in South Korea that disrupted the banking and ATM systems could be significant. I think it's too early to tell who actually caused them. I think the latest I've heard is it may have originated out of China, but the potential that it could have originated out of North Korea, could have originated out of China in support of North Korea, or the fact that some elements of the Chinese state conducting these attacks, irregardless of North Korea, but yet introducing this into a sort of an unstable situation. I'd like the panelists to address that.
Well, I think you're correct. I'm sure there's a lot of work going on up at Fort Meade right now and other places to determine exactly what caused the attacks or where did they come from yesterday. But clearly Kim Jong-un has stated that he wants to have, and he's developing a cyber capability, an offensive cyber capability. And I think as you look at the command and control systems that are in place in South Korea and the economic reliance on the network, not only in South Korea but really around the world, it is another form of attack that I think would be of value to Kim Jong-un. That's why it's very critical that both South Korea, the United States, and really the world have the capabilities to defend from such an attack. Because I think he sees it as, again, another opportunity to threaten the world.
No, I totally agree. I think North Korea looks at cyber. We haven't seen very much there, and I think the assessment is that they're probably not overly sophisticated, but we don't really know. And as we don't know about if they were complicit with this event, work is being done, and that will be determined, and we will know. But I think the sense is this is obviously another weapon, and a country that's working on its nuclear capabilities to include uranium enrichment and delivery systems. Certainly, they're going to be looking at all weapons, and cyber is part of that equation.
Can you wait for the mic?
Natalia Trubnikov, former executive assistant to the executive director's office representing the Office of Korea and Asia Pacific countries at the IMF. Does the North Korean president realize the extent of the sacrifice that the countries would be making, the community, as they will provide that assistance to their people, and that they're willing to do it despite the current economic crisis and the needs and priorities right now to worry about their own budgets? I wonder if he realized the extent of the sacrifice the community are willing to make, if he would have appreciated a lot more the steps that we're willing to do to go back to negotiating with them.
That's a very good point. That's an excellent point. It should not be taken for granted that the international community, the largesse of the international community is there, but it is there for the reasons I think, I agree with General Sharp and Vic, because of the humanitarian aspects to see the people, the element of malnourishment. And in the 90s, we saw actually starvation, significant numbers. I think that element drives the international community, although there are significant economic issues that the community is looking at for themselves, to say, we've got to give, and we're there. And I think I don't know how well the leadership in the DPRK appreciates that, but your point's a very good point. That should be appreciated. I would imagine the people of North Korea appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm not sure Kim Jong-un cares. I'm not sure he cares about his people. In fact, I'm pretty confident he doesn't. If you look at where he and his father put their resources, and is putting their resources today, I think it's about regime survival.
The only thing, if I could add, I would add that the one thing, I think, one thing that has changed in terms of on the human rights situation is that it's much more of a mainstream issue now than it has been in the past. I think part of that obviously has to do with work of a lot of the NGOs that have gone out and talked about the human rights violations in North Korea. But I also think it's a lot of these books that have been written by people like Barbara Demick and Blaine Harden and others, describing the lives of some of these North Koreans that have really taken it much more mainstream. And I think I would agree with Joe that I think that there is in spite of the problems around the world today financially, I think there's a tremendous amount of support if an opening was there to help the North Korean people. I think that's pretty clear. We have time for a couple more. You've been waiting patiently, and then in the back center there. So.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. Yeah, Ambassador, I'm wondering, Obama came to office 4 years ago promising more engagement, talks, negotiation with not just North Korea, but Iran, Cuba. But a lot of criticisms say that he has not done very enough in that regard with all these countries. Why you think is that? General, actually, North Korea been living under tough sanction, all pressure for 3 generations. So you give a long list of more sanction pressure. Why do you think that's going to work? I mean, they've been living under that for decades. Thank you.
Yeah, well, on the sanctions, I think your point's a valid point. But I think we also see, you mentioned Iran, I think the sanctions are biting there. I think the sanctions are biting, and certainly with the new series, the new resolution at the United Nations just last month, that's touching the banking systems, that's touching the financial flows, but also touching the movement of materials to include their own diplomats moving around the country and possibly coming in with money. I think it's that there will be pain in that now. Is that going to be overly consequential? Who knows on that point? But the point is, there needs to be consequences to defy the UN Security Council resolutions and so forth with impunity and say there are no consequences for your actions. I think it would make us all look rather foolish and weak, and one would say maybe condition some to believe they could just get away with anything they want to. So there needs to be consequences for actions, point one. I think engagement, I mentioned, sir, that with the Leap Day Agreement, that's 1 year ago, where there was significant dialogue with the DPRK and an agreement with the moratorium, with nutritional assistance and so forth. So I think the dialogue with the DPRK has continued with the Obama administration. So, and Iran, I think we know that. We see in the press what's going on there and so forth. So, but we're just talking about North Korea. I think this administration has been forward-leaning and has been available to the leadership in Pyongyang, but there has to be some element of reciprocity.
Yeah, and I think basically I'd say the same thing. I think the sanctions are necessary, but not sufficient, as I said in my talks. And I do think the sanctions have slowed down North Korea's ability to be able to produce nuclear weapons and ballistic missile capability. Obviously has not stopped it, but I think they'd be further along than they are today if there were no sanctions. And I agree with Joe. The willingness of the United States to talk to Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un is there, has been there, but on the conditions that it's not just talk, that there are true actions that are demonstrated, because I think we have learned over decades that talk is used by people in North Korea not just to get aid, but to get the time they need to develop nuclear and ballistic missile capability.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think it's hard. I mean, one may have been able to fault previous administrations for not leaning forward enough on this issue. I think it's very hard to fault the current administration for not leaning forward enough. It's been pretty clear that they've had an inclination to have some sort of engagement with the North, but it just has not been reciprocated. So, okay, I think we have time for one more question. Gentleman in the center there.
Greg Tillman, Arms Control Association. And I guess this question is for you, Joe. Wouldn't we be better off with an embassy in Pyongyang in the same way that we were better off with Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao Zedong's China, once we had diplomatic relations? And I know it wouldn't be easy, but we seem to be treating it as the very last stage of engaging the North Koreans. Why don't we see it as a means to get to the end by improving communication and understanding of North Korea instead of relying on Dennis Rodman interviews?
No, that's an excellent point. In fact, that was, and Victor was very much involved in these negotiations, that has always been on the table, similar to a liaison office, putting something there before there is formal diplomatic relations. That's always been there. Your point's exactly on the mark. And that was part of the discussions in September 2005 with the joint statement, that we could kickstart the process by having liaison office interest sections, if you will, in the respective capitals. So the U.S. has been heretofore very amenable, and I think we always would be amenable to that. Victor?
I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, I think it has always been a part of the broader negotiation that the United States has really done over the past 25 years with North Korea in terms of what would be on the table.
Yeah.
And in terms of how much we would learn, I mean, a lot of the European countries have embassies there now, and their ambassadors cycle through Washington quite often. Right. And they actually don't, they, I think, are working very hard, but the amount of information they actually get by being on the ground, the value add, it's not really clear at this point. Now, maybe it would be different if we're the United States, but again, that has always been a part of the overall package. The problem is we haven't been able to get to start in terms of talking about this package.
Would that be a concession at this point to suggest that the liaison office, is that right in
I mean, I think we're so far from that point right now that it's hard to conceive of this administration or any administration sort of throwing that on the table now, because I mean, it's not even clear what it would get you. So I think we're kind of very far from that point. I mean, I hate to end on such a depressing note, and we can't even talk about good spring weather outside because it looks like it's going to snow. So let me just end by thanking our two panelists for joining us today, thanking the audience for coming out first thing in the morning for this.